a systemic approach to addiction as a post-traumatic phenomena when addictions join the family. I would like to ask you, what is addiction, Anngwyn, in your eyes, in your work?
Yeah. Um, there's no overall agreement about that. However, for the trauma people, our understanding is that addictions bind energy for something that's too much. So addictions are a way, they're attempts really at self-medication and self-regulation. And addictions, of course, sometimes there's a primary addiction, sometimes the addictions overlap. From a systemic perspective, however, we have a very specific point of view, which is the addiction is, and this is really important, Alexandra, this is really key, that from a systemic perspective, the addiction is not the problem. The addiction is the symptom of the problem. So what is the problem? The problem is unresolved trauma. And Gabor Mate said something recently succinct about that. He said, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And basically it's the same message. And we really part company with people who are specializing in addiction recovery programs, and so on, who are focused on getting people to stop drinking, stop smoking, stop whatever. And it's like, that's a good thing to do. However, it is the nature of addictions to shapeshift. So stop drinking, start smoking, stop smoking, start eating, stop eating, eating to stop all that. Then you have sex addiction, and you have workaholism, and then you have computer. And the addiction, the energy has to be bound somehow to keep from overwhelming the person. And the energy is the unresolved trauma. So the more the addictions shapeshift, the more intense they are likely to be, or sometimes people spread them out. So a little bit with the drinking, a little bit with the smoking, a little bit with the gambling and the computers. And, Gurdjieff called these management strategies doors. He said, when things get too much, people take these doors, and the doors can be alcohol, drugs, sex, work, violence, whatever. And it's true. However, I think from our perspective, from a systemic perspective, we do not see the addict as the quote IP, the identified patient. We see the addict in the context of their system and how the system is affected by the addiction, and how even the system may be working to keep the addiction intact. And addictions are very often transgenerational. So we get into territory of looking at what Bert Hellinger would call entanglements. In trauma work, we talk about trauma bonds as a way of connecting. They're not exactly the same, but they are related. So we do have a particular point of view, which is, I think, more holistic. Also seeing, Bert Hellinger gave a marvelous lecture about the greater forces that shape family systems. And these greater forces are like war, famine, epidemic, immigration, emigration, religion, political upset, natural disasters. So to see a family separate from their culture, I think is a little bit too narrow a view. And certain cultures are prone to certain addictions and not others. So all in all, the topic is rather complex. Um, we could do lots and lots of conferences on trauma and addiction from a systemic point of view. I mean, I've certainly done workshops on that theme.
Do addictions have an effect in different levels in an individual, in a family? We can mention like physical effects, behavioral effects. Could you expand on this?
Well, I would say for the most part that addiction is a somatic experience. And for some addictions are more dangerous than others. For example, cocaine is very dangerous, heroin is very dangerous. But the traumas underlying heroin addiction and cocaine addiction are very different. And the nature of the addiction is a clue that tells us where we are likely to find the unresolved trauma. Very different from alcohol or gambling or sex addiction. I mean, I'm not passing out recipes here, but I think there is a very specific relationship between the addiction of choice or addiction constellation of choices and unresolved trauma that helps us to get to the root of the issue much faster than saying, oh, addiction. It's like, well, they're not all the same, and they're not the same strategy for managing overwhelm. So it's a little bit of sometimes I have a little bit of a mystery, a little bit of a treasure hunt to find out what's really going on with the person, with the system, with the larger system, and how does that relate to the culture?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in the soul level, there are several levels to heal through constellation work. In these dynamics that take place with addiction in a family, being around people that are part of our system and might enhance the condition, how can we work deep to help a person rebalance and heal this dynamic within their soul?
Well, I think awareness is the first step, is to, first of all, one of the greatest challenges in addiction work is denial. Mm-hmm. That we use the term, we're all walking around the elephant in the living room pretending it isn't there. And the powers of denial and addiction are very, very strong. Not only with the individual, but with a family, with a system. That it's not really a problem. I can stop anytime. Leave me alone. I'm really fine. I only drink at parties, or so I smoke and I have a cough and leave me alone, and so on. However, with the substance addictions, the physical consequences can force people into facing, and their loved ones, into facing reality, that this is becoming health threatening, life threatening, and of course has a very serious impact on relationships, often for generations. But the major challenge is denial. So if we can get through the denial to, oh, well, maybe there is a problem, to not see the addiction as the problem, but as an attempt to resolve something else. And what is that? And, I'm not saying that systemic constellation work cures addiction. It's not my feeling. My experience is it can open up a lot of doors toward moving into a recovery program, because then they know exactly what they're dealing with and how far back this, whatever it is they're struggling with, may go back through systems even larger than family. So I don't see this kind of constellation work as necessarily curative, but it certainly offers revelation into what is the real issue here.
Yeah.
For example, with smoking, very often the issue is grief, loss, and abandonment. It's a very different issue with cocaine, where the cocaine, people who are vulnerable to uppers are people who are dealing with depression and sense of power, issues of power and powerlessness. Very different from the heroin addicts. These are the people who are extremely sensitive, are having a difficult time in a difficult world. Very different issues. So it all looks like addiction, but it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes it's interesting to just begin by setting up the addict and the addiction. Start very simple. And sometimes the representative for the addiction will turn into a specific person. And that is a clue to where we need to go from there. Or, you know, Bert Hellinger said that the disease always wants to help, which is difficult for those of us trained in other traditions. Like, nobody wants this kind of help. But in my experience, when we work systemically in constellation, the representative for the disease is wanting to help. And I think there's something similar that goes on with the addiction, that the addiction is wanting to help. It holds the energy of something that's too much. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. So obviously it is a risk to work with some forms of therapy that can block the symptom and not allow for the messenger and the help that is being required to really come to surface, right?
Yeah, and you know, I have issues with symptom-oriented therapies, because they think the symptom is the problem, and from a systemic point of view, the symptom is the symptom of the problem. So it's more or less like if you have a building and the fire alarm goes off, it's very noisy and upsets everybody, and you turn it off, but the building is still on fire. So in my experience, when we turn off the symptom, the building is still on fire, and the symptom will shapeshift into something else, sometimes more serious. And this is particularly true of phobias. It's very easy to get rid of phobias. You can do it with hypnosis, you can do it with tapping, you can do it with eye movement. It's very easy. But the problem is the phobia isn't the problem. The phobia is the symptom of the problem. So if you hang up the phone before you get the message, you're going to get more symptoms, in my experience. And I've studied all these methods of, and I don't do them because, I mean, and if I have a symptom I want it gone, I understand that. However, there's a risk there that the symptom will shapeshift and maybe go into something deeper and more dangerous. And Karl-Heinz Rauscher's done marvelous work, still doing, which he called, and he's a medical doctor, as you know, and a shaman, and he says symptoms are messages, and I believe that. And he said, I don't want this message, I'm hanging up the phone, turn off the fire alarm, is, I think, potentially dangerous.
Yes, 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 definitely, definitely. So, do you often find that this historical context that has taken place in world history uh, runs deep into families manifesting in addictions?
Mhm, mhm. Definitely, if you look, for example, at the history of countries, Europe and East Europe is classic, including Russia. They've had revolving door wars and revolutions where families were broken up, the men were taken away, or if they survived, were damaged. The women and children weren't protected. They had to do everything themselves. This was very hard on relationships, but also when people came back from battle or whatever the conflict was, very often they don't they can't tell their loved ones what happened. They don't want to tell them. They want to protect them from the horrors, and they get in trauma bonds with other survivors. And what they do very often is they get together and smoke and drink,
Mhm.
and to the exclusion of family members. And you see this pattern throughout uh, Eastern and Western Europe. And in Latin America, you have the effects of post colonial social engineering. And many of the events that happened in these histories meant that families were separated, men were taken away, sold into slavery, women and children, and of course the genocides of Native people. And that's too much. These are overwhelming um, somatic experiences, and people cope uh, with whatever drugs are available and behaviors.
Mhm.
And one of these is violence. I think Gurdjieff was right about that. Uh,
So, when a seeker comes to you, a client, and starts opening his issue, his, uh, how do you combine your inner connection with somatic experience in regards to all the information that is coming in as to where to start working? Yes, my cat is here.
yeah, and there's the cat. As cats are always welcome. Um, I'm definitely a cat person. For me, somatic experience and trauma and all of that is not separate from system.
Yeah.
I- and the way I work personally is, I'm also highly trained in art and how to see. And I really look at the client because it has been my experience, and people laugh at me about this. You know, um, clients almost always wear their issues and their resources. And you see it a lot, for example, in jewelry or the colors that maybe they're in all black or all purple or um, and I might start from saying something about, tell me about this pearl earring that you're wearing, and oh my goodness, it opens the whole story. um,
Mhm.
I asked a Japanese lady about the pearl earring she was wearing, and it opened up the whole story of the family having an oyster farm in Japan and the war and the immigration. It all started with, tell me about this pearl you're wearing. So I think it's very important to look at the client. And it's been a lot of fun at my expense. Like, this American lady, all she cares about is fashion. Uh, it, and I do enjoy fashion, but that's not what I'm doing. I am looking at the client who is sitting there with clues. In the history of art, when you look at portraits, you have a two-dimensional format, or maybe the limitation of a sculpture, um, that it's the details that in the iconography that tell you who are this person, where do they belong in space-time, and why they're being depicted. And sometimes, you see an older lady come in dressed like a teenager, or you see men who come in dressed like toddlers with their pants falling down, like, and it's like, aha, time stopped for them. So I would say, tell me what happened when you were maybe 2 or 3 years old. Or I would say to the old lady dressed like a teenager, how was your adolescence? Is there anything there that might be unresolved? Because you can see they're stuck in time and they're wearing that time zone where the fixation is. And Peter used to say that the essence of trauma work is bringing people out of fixation into flow. And part of the fixation has to do with time. They're stuck in some other time zone. It was definitely true of my own parents, who really never got out of the 40s. The Depression, the war, and they saw the world until they died. They were nearly 100 years old, but they still saw the world in terms of the Depression and post-war era. They were literally fixated in time. And whole systems can get stuck in time. I was living in Belgium when the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia. And in the next, I was living in a little village, and the next morning there was nothing in the stores, empty. And I said, where is everybody? What happened to the store? And they said, oh, madam, you don't understand anything. We know they're coming again, because Belgium is flat and it has a seaport. And anytime there's a war, the first thing is that Belgium gets invaded. For its farmland and its ports. And when they heard Russians were in Czechoslovakia, they emptied the stores because they were still fixated in that time zone. And that's what trauma does. And it was, not one person thinking that way. The whole village reacted like, we have to hide our food. And fortunately, and I said something stupid like, it's not going to happen. The Americans are here. We'll defend you. And they just, yeah, like you did last time. I mean, but whole nations can get stuck in time as well. This is trauma. This is collective trauma, and this is fixation.
Mm-hmm. So history matters, as you say. History is so important to have a context of where the systemic problem might be lying, right? Yeah.
Bert Hellinger knew that for sure. He was very aware of that, and also of the cross-cultural variations on our understanding of history. And in the mental health profession, when people train to be psychologists or psychotherapists or psychiatric whatever, history is nowhere in the curriculum, nowhere. And isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So, the medical model is we have a disease symptom and we have to fix it, medicate it, or do some, I don't know, hypnosis, some eye movement. We have to, they don't see that there's a whole historical context that's contributing to this experience that the client's having. And I think that's one of the reasons I needed to write all those books.
Yes.
is to put collective trauma work in historical context as well. And I think for Latin America, it's especially important that so many of the symptoms, which appear to be individual or families, are really a direct result of the colonialism and post-colonial eras, for sure.
Wonderful,
Genocide,
Anngwyn.
slavery, political unrest, economic collapse. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so wide. It's so wide. The movements are so many, and I think this is one of your most precious jewels in your work. How you have brought this collective trauma historically into constellations, and it is one of the things